Hello everyone, we are Bonnie
and Debby
Feldman. We grew up in the northern suburbs of Cape Town, and our late father, Phillip Feldman, also known as Phillip Feldman, was a Holocaust survivor from Lithuania. I just want to show you a photograph, a family photograph. They came from a town called Alytus in Vilna, in Lithuania. And my father is the little boy right in front. He was one of 9 children and he was the youngest. Okay.
So this photo was taken sometime before the war, probably about 1925.
So my father was in Vilna at the time of the German invasion. He was a student, and the Germans invaded, and then Debbie, you wanted to talk about the ghetto.
So then he was forced into the ghetto in Vilna, and while in the Vilna ghetto, he would go out with work parties to go and work in different fields and do different jobs. And the one day they were taken to an airstrip to work in the airstrip, and he sensed that there was something wrong that day. There were a lot more soldiers with a lot more guns around. So he and some friends made a run, and thank goodness they did make the run, and they managed to get into the forest to join the partisans.
So my father spent a few years during the war as a Jewish partisan in Lithuania. It was very difficult for us to imagine the man that we knew ever having held a rifle, fired a rifle, blown up a train line or something like that. But that's, I guess, what he was forced into. After the war, it wasn't immediate, it took quite a long time. My father ended up coming to Southern Rhodesia, as it was called then, today it's Zimbabwe, because he had a brother there who had gone there before the war.
Dad had tried to get into South Africa, but because of the requirements of being able to speak a European language, he wasn't allowed in. Little did it kind of think the number of different European languages he could speak, but of course they didn't include English or Afrikaans.
So he ended up there, and then eventually met my mother, who was South African, and they got married, lived in Rhodesia for a number of years. They were very happy there. But unfortunately, economic issues after UDI in Rhodesia meant that they couldn't make much of a go of things, and they left the country and came to South Africa, which is just sad that he had to, on the way, run again. So growing up in the northern suburbs of Cape Town was probably not the easiest of things in terms of my father's life there. I think there were a lot of identity issues for somebody who was quite an intellectual man, actually, an academic man, but forced into working as the owner of a butchery because he couldn't finish his education, and he had lost his childhood as well. So I feel that he was probably always suffered a sort of low level of depression. He didn't have a madly positive outlook on life, and he, I think, felt probably a little uncomfortable in the world that we all lived in. Debbie, do you want to talk about how we felt and what we experienced of his history?
Well, unfortunately, we were too young when he'd passed away. Well, we were in our early 20s, but we weren't yet interested enough to kind of ask the questions. So they're only bits and pieces that we know. Unfortunately, there are just too many unfinished questions, unanswered questions rather, that we never got to ask. But what we do always kind of remember is the Sharita Plita luncheons after the Yom HaShoah service at this cemetery. Is we would always go to somebody's house and there would be a wonderful luncheon. And it was at those luncheons that there was lots of crying, lots of tears, but also lots of laughter. And all the different survivors would tell stories, would reminisce, and that was the most wonderful time. And there are memories of that we still luckily do have, and some of the stories that came out from then.
Yeah, I think that my father had such distrust. He had faced so much anti-Semitism in his life, not just during the war years. There was anti-Semitism, terrible anti-Semitism when he was growing up. He got into university under numerous classes, which was only a certain number of Jews were allowed in. He was threatened, his life was threatened when he came back home after the war by the Lithuanians. And so I think he never really trusted other people. and never felt that Jews could really take their equal place in society or really stand out as leaders. And I think it's also partially a refugee mentality that's really about, well, they let us into this country, so just, keep your head down and keep quiet. And yes, Debbie mentioned the unanswered questions. I also feel there were lots and lots of things that I would have liked to have asked before he passed away, but we were too young, and it wasn't an era when people were really talking very much anyhow.
But then I think as children, we actually were quite lucky in that we didn't experience what a lot of other people we've since heard about experienced, living with families where perhaps both parents were survivors. Because, first of all, my mother wasn't a survivor, but also she's the one, I think, who cushioned a lot for us. She would kind of listen to my father's stories, and she apparently, before we were born, used to console him at night when he had terrible nightmares. Now, we didn't experience that. But the one thing we kind of do know that we really did experience was the whole thing about everything that was anti-German. And I was saying earlier that as a little child, I remember not being able to even think of asking my parents to buy German pencils. I mean, everybody else had Stapler pencils, but I knew I was just never going to ask a question like that.
I think probably the one thing we've taken out of this is that we do have a very strong consciousness and knowledge of what happened, very committed to not ever letting that sort of thing happen again. And I think Debbie in particular as a teacher is able to push that message quite importantly.
Yes, and also as my role as a school librarian, I'm able very often to bring that in, not only at the time of Yom HaShoah, but whenever there's a book that comes up under discussion, is to introduce the book, to tell the story, and to explain kind of what happened, but in all different levels, from the grade 1s up to the grade 7s grade 6s rather, that we'll deal with, to be able to have age-appropriate books to expose children to the horrors of that time.
And finally, I think in closing, it's just very important, the sort of initiative that the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre has undertaken. Stories need to be told, whether it's by the survivors themselves, of whom there are very few left, or by the next generation, because we do carry certain stories, we had certain experiences, and the world needs to know about them.
Thank you.